1861, the United States was not yet at war. There were no marching armies, no battlefields soaked in blood, no formal declarations of conflict. And yet, the country was already broken. For decades, Americans had argued, negotiated, compromised, and postponed the same question. A question powerful enough to divide churches, families, and entire states. Could a nation built on liberty survive while allowing human bondage? Every generation had tried to delay the answer. Every delay made the problem larger. By the time Abraham Lincoln took office, 7 southern states had already left the Union. Federal forts stood in hostile territory. The Constitution meant different things to different Americans. Peace still existed on paper, but unity did not. This was not the story of a sudden collapse. It was the result of years of warnings ignored, lines crossed, and choices postponed. The Civil War did not begin because America wanted war. It began because, by 1861, there was no peaceful way left to stay together. Slavery at the center of everything. To understand why the Civil War became inevitable, we have to begin with a truth that shaped every argument, every compromise, and every fear. Slavery was not a side issue in American life. It was central. By the mid-19th century, nearly 4 million people were enslaved in the United States, most of them in the southern states. Their labor powered the southern economy, especially the production of cotton, a crop so profitable that it tied American prosperity directly to human bondage. Cotton from southern plantations fed textile mills in the north and in Europe. Banks financed it. Ports shipped it. Factories depended on it. Slavery was not isolated. It was woven into the nation's economic fabric. But slavery was more than an economic system. It was a social order, a political structure, and a deeply contested moral issue. In the South, slavery shaped everyday life. Wealth, status, and political power were tied to land ownership and enslaved labor. Even Southern whites who did not own slaves often supported the system, believing it protected their social standing and racial hierarchy. In the North, slavery had largely disappeared by the early 1800s. The economy there was changing toward manufacturing, trade, and wage labor. Many Northerners opposed slavery's expansion, not always out of moral conviction, but out of fear that enslaved labor would undercut free workers and dominate new territories. This created 2 very different visions of America. One saw slavery as essential to freedom, the freedom to own property, to control labor, to preserve a way of life. The other increasingly saw slavery as incompatible with the nation's founding ideals, even if many were unwilling to support full racial equality. As the nation expanded westward, this divide became impossible to ignore. Every new territory raised the same explosive question: would it allow slavery or not? The issue was not simply moral, it was political. The balance of power in Congress depended on whether new states entered the Union as free or slave states. Each decision threatened to tip the scales, and with it, the future of the nation. Slavery turned the westward expansion of the United States into a battlefield long before any war began. Attempts to control slavery's spread only deepened resentments. To many Southerners, limiting slavery's expansion felt like a direct attack on their economic survival and political power. To many Northerners, allowing its spread felt like surrendering the future of the Republic to a system they believed was wrong or dangerous. By the 1850s, slavery had poisoned nearly every national conversation. Tariffs, infrastructure, foreign policy, and federal authority were all filtered through one overriding fear: who would control the future of the United States? Slavery was no longer just an institution. It had become the lens through which Americans understood freedom, power, and identity. And as long as slavery remained unresolved, every compromise carried a breaking point. To hold the nation together, leaders turned again and again to compromise. But each attempt bought time, not peace. Compromise after compromise fails. For decades, America survived not by solving its deepest conflict, but by delaying it. Whenever tensions over slavery threatened to tear the nation apart, leaders reached for compromise, carefully balanced agreements meant to keep the Union intact. At first, these compromises worked, or at least they seemed to. In 1820, the Missouri Compromise admitted Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state, preserving the balance of power in Congress. It also drew a line across the continent, promising that slavery would not expand north of it. For a moment, the nation breathed easier, but the compromise did not settle the question of slavery. It merely moved it into the future. As the United States continued to expand, new land meant new arguments, and each argument became harder to contain. The Compromise of 1850 was even more complex. California entered the Union as a free state. Other territories would decide the slavery question themselves. And to appease Southern slaveholders, Congress passed a strengthened Fugitive Slave Act. That law changed everything. It required citizens in free states to assist in capturing escaped enslaved people. Those accused of escape were denied jury trials. Federal authority now enforced slavery on Northern soil. For many Northerners, compromise no longer felt neutral. It felt like complicity. Resistance grew. Personal liberty laws appeared in Northern states. Underground railroad networks expanded. The moral divide widened. Then came the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. It repealed the Missouri Compromise line entirely, allowing settlers to vote on whether slavery would exist in their territory. The result was chaos. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers flooded into Kansas, each side determined to control its future. Violence followed. Burned towns, armed militias, and political murders. The press called it Bleeding Kansas. Compromise had not prevented conflict. It had brought it closer. By the late 1850s, trust between North and South had collapsed. Each new agreement felt temporary, fragile, and unfair. Each side believed the other was acting in bad faith. What once looked like political skill now looked like weakness. Compromise required mutual sacrifice, but neither side believed it could afford to give ground. The nation was no longer debating policy. It was fighting over survival. And with every failed compromise, the possibility of a peaceful solution grew smaller. As compromise failed, Americans turned to the Constitution itself, hoping the law could succeed where politics had not. The Constitution under strain. When compromise failed, Americans turned to the Constitution, believing the nation's highest law could resolve what politics no longer could. But instead of uniting the country, the Constitution became another source of division. From the beginning, the document had contained contradictions. It spoke of liberty and equality, yet protected slavery through clauses on representation, taxation, and the return of escaped enslaved people. For decades, those contradictions had been managed, often quietly, often uneasily. By the 1850s, they could no longer be ignored. At the heart of the crisis was a fundamental disagreement. Did the federal government have the authority to limit slavery, or did the states have the right to decide for themselves? Southern leaders argued that slavery was protected by the Constitution. They claimed enslaved people were property and that the federal government had no right to interfere with that property. Many Northerners disagreed. They believed Congress had the power to restrict slavery's expansion, and that the nation could not survive half free and half enslaved. This legal conflict reached its breaking point in 1857 with the Supreme Court's decision in Dred Scott versus Sanford. Dred Scott was an enslaved man who had lived with his owner in free territories. He argued that residence on free soil made him free. The court ruled against him. In its decision, the Supreme Court declared that African Americans, enslaved or free, were not citizens and therefore had no right to sue in federal court. It also ruled that Congress had no authority to ban slavery in the territories. The ruling shocked the North. To many, it appeared that the highest court in the land had permanently legalized slavery's expansion. In the South, the decision was celebrated. It seemed to confirm what slaveholders had argued all along, that slavery was protected by the Constitution itself. Instead of settling the issue, the ruling hardened positions on both sides. Faith in the Constitution as a neutral referee began to collapse. The document that once symbolized unity now meant different things to different Americans. Each side believed the law was on its side. Each believed the other was violating the nation's founding principles. As legal interpretations clashed, the Constitution no longer restrained conflict. It amplified it. And when a nation can no longer agree on the meaning of its own laws, the path toward violence grows clearer. As legal arguments failed, words began to give way to action, and violence entered American politics. Violence enters politics. For much of America's early history, political conflict had been fought with words, through speeches, newspapers, and heated debate. By the mid-1850s, that was no longer enough. As compromise collapsed and the Constitution failed to settle the slavery question, violence began to replace argument. Nowhere was this more visible than in the Kansas Territory. Under the Kansas-Nebraska Act, settlers were allowed to vote on whether slavery would be legal. Both sides rushed in, determined to control the outcome. Ballot boxes were stuffed, elections were disputed, armed groups formed to protect competing governments. Kansas descended into chaos. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces burned towns, destroyed farms, and killed political opponents. What had once been a legal debate became a series of armed confrontations. The nation watched as Americans killed Americans over the future of slavery. The violence did not stay on the frontier. In 1856, on the floor of the United States Senate, South Carolina Congressman Preston Brooks attacked Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner with a cane, beating him unconscious after a speech criticizing slavery. Sumner nearly died. Brooks became a hero in the South. Canes were sent to him in the mail as symbols of support. The message was clear. Political violence was no longer taboo. Then, in 1859, the country was shaken by an event that pushed fear to its limits. John Brown, a radical abolitionist, led a raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. His goal was to spark a widespread enslaved uprising. The plan failed. Brown was captured, tried, and executed. In the North, some hailed him as a martyr. In the South, he was seen as proof that abolitionists were willing to destroy Southern society by force. Trust evaporated. Each side began to view the other not as political opponents, but as enemies. Fear replaced negotiation. Preparation replaced compromise. By the end of the 1850s, Americans had already crossed a psychological threshold. Violence was no longer unthinkable. It was becoming normal. And once a nation accepts violence as a political tool, peace becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. As blood was shed, Americans began to realize something even more dangerous, that they were no longer part of the same country in spirit, even if they remained one on paper. 2 incompatible Americas. By the late 1850s, the United States was no longer simply divided over policy. It was divided over identity. The North and the South were becoming two fundamentally different societies, with different economies, values, and visions of the future. In the North, cities grew rapidly, factories expanded, railroads connected markets and people. Most labor was performed by free workers, and the idea of progress was increasingly tied to industry, innovation, and social mobility. In the South, the economy remained largely agricultural. Wealth was concentrated in land and enslaved labor. Cotton dominated both the landscape and the economy, and slavery shaped social order, political power, and daily life. These differences went beyond economics. Northerners increasingly spoke of free labor as the foundation of democracy. The belief that individuals should be able to work, earn wages, and improve their lives. Slavery, to many, threatened that ideal. In the South, slavery was defended not only as an economic necessity, but as a positive good, a system they believed upheld social stability and racial hierarchy. Each side believed the other threatened its survival. Southern leaders feared that a growing Northern population would dominate Congress and the presidency, eventually using federal power to destroy slavery. They saw restriction as the first step toward abolition. Northerners, meanwhile, feared the spread of slavery into the Western territories, believing it would give slaveholders permanent control over the federal government. Even the concept of freedom began to mean different things. In the North, freedom was increasingly defined as individual opportunity and mobility. In the South, freedom was often defined as the right to own property, including enslaved people, without interference. Religion, education, and the press reinforced these divisions. Newspapers portrayed the other side as dangerous, immoral, or un-American. Sermons and speeches hardened moral boundaries. By 1860, Americans were not just disagreeing, they were no longer speaking the same political language. Compromise requires shared assumptions. By this point, those assumptions were gone. The Union still existed, but the sense of a single national community had already collapsed. And when a nation stops seeing itself as one people, conflict becomes more than likely. It becomes inevitable. That deep division would soon be tested, not by violence or law, but by a single election, the election of 1860. By 1860, the nation's divisions were no longer theoretical. They were about to be tested in the most powerful way possible, through the election of a president. This was not a normal election. The Democratic Party split in two. Northern Democrats supported Stephen A. Douglas, who promoted popular sovereignty, letting territories decide the slavery question themselves. Southern Democrats rejected him and nominated John C. Breckinridge, who demanded federal protection for slavery in the territories. A third party, the Constitutional Union Party, tried to avoid the issue altogether, nominating John Bell and calling simply for the preservation of the Union. Republicans chose Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was not calling for the immediate abolition of slavery where it already existed, but he was firm on one point: slavery must not expand. To the South, that position was unacceptable. Lincoln's name did not even appear on the ballot in many Southern states. When he won the presidency, he did so without a single Southern electoral vote. The result was devastating to Southern leaders. They saw Lincoln's victory not as a political disagreement, but as proof that the South had lost its voice in the federal government. For them, the balance of power had tipped permanently. Secession, once a threat, now seemed like the only option left. Within weeks of the election, Southern legislatures met in emergency sessions. Debate turned to action. If remaining in the Union meant living under a government hostile to slavery, many believed departure was necessary for survival. The election of 1860 did not cause the nation's divisions. It revealed them. And once the ballots were counted, the final illusion of unity disappeared. The election was over. The choice now facing the South was no longer political. It was existential. Secession makes war unavoidable. After the election of 1860, events moved quickly and deliberately. South Carolina acted first. On December 20th, 1860, it formally seceded from the Union, declaring that the federal government had violated its rights and endangered slavery. Within weeks, 6 more states followed: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. These states did not drift away. They left through conventions, declarations, and votes. Secession was a conscious political decision. In February 1861, representatives from the seceded states met in Montgomery, Alabama, to form a new nation, the Confederate States of America. They adopted a constitution that explicitly protected slavery. The break was no longer theoretical. Yet even as the Confederacy took shape, war was not immediately inevitable, but peace was. The problem lay in the nature of secession itself. The United States government did not recognize the legality of states leaving the Union. Abraham Lincoln, preparing to take office, argued that the Union was perpetual. Allowing secession, he believed, would destroy the Constitution and invite permanent instability. At the same time, the seceded states viewed federal authority within their borders as foreign occupation. This created an impossible situation. Federal forts, arsenals and property still existed inside the Confederacy. The most prominent of these was Fort Sumter, located in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. To the Confederacy, federal troops inside their claimed territory were an insult to sovereignty. To the Union, abandoning those forts would be a recognition of secession. There was no compromise position. Any attempt by the Union to resupply or reinforce its forts could be seen as aggression. Any decision to withdraw would signal surrender. Diplomatic efforts continued briefly. Last-minute proposals were introduced in Congress, but trust had collapsed. Neither side believed the other was negotiating honestly. By early 1861, both governments were mobilizing. Militias formed, weapons were seized, command structures were organized. War planning had begun, even if war had not yet started. Secession transformed political disagreement into a territorial and military crisis. Two governments now claimed authority over the same land. Both believed their survival depended on standing firm. At that point, violence was no longer a possibility. It was a matter of time. The final test would come at a small federal fort in Charleston Harbor, where one decision would ignite 4 years of war. No peaceful way forward. The war begins. By the spring of 1861, the United States stood at a dead end. Abraham Lincoln had taken office determined to preserve the Union, but his options were painfully limited. He could recognize secession and allow the nation to dissolve, or he could defend federal authority and risk war. There was no third path. At the center of this dilemma stood Fort Sumter. The fort was a small federal installation in Charleston Harbor, isolated, undersupplied, and surrounded by Confederate forces. To the Union, it symbolized national authority. To the Confederacy, it represented foreign power on sovereign land. Lincoln chose a careful course. He announced that the fort would be resupplied but not reinforced. No attack was intended, no provocation was claimed. The Confederate leadership saw the decision differently. Allowing Union ships into Charleston Harbor would undermine their claim to independence. To do nothing would be to accept federal authority. On April 12, 1861, Confederate artillery opened fire on Fort Sumter. For 34 hours, shells struck the fort. No soldiers were killed during the bombardment, but the meaning was unmistakable. The war had begun. What followed was not the result of a single decision, or a single election, or a single moment of violence. It was the outcome of decades of unresolved conflict, of compromises that postponed reckoning, of laws that divided instead of unified, of a nation that could no longer agree on what it stood for. The Civil War did not erupt suddenly. It arrived because every peaceful path had already been exhausted, and once the first shots were fired, there was no turning back. With compromise gone and war underway, the fate of the United States would now be decided not in Congress, but on the battlefield. Thank you for watching. If you found this piece of history compelling, please like this video and subscribe for more stories that shaped our world.